C1. Ramu. Just waiting for Steven. Oh, this is already not a good sign. I haven't spoken a single word out loud today, except maybe to my cats, probably. So my voice is like, not. It's not. Hi, Steven. Okie dokie, so where we left off, Kvoth is, hunting for assassins, or what did he call them? Is that what he called them? But we're not sure if there really are assassins, or if he's just being duped. But either way, the mayor, he figured out, is just trying to get rid of him for some reason. Okay, so we're on chapter 75. The Players. Over the next few hours of walking, I did my best to get to know the men Alvaron had saddled me with. I speak figuratively, of course, as one of them was a woman, and we were all 5 of us afoot. Tempe caught my eye first, and held it the longest, as he was the first Adem mercenary I'd ever met. Far from being the imposing, hard-eyed killer I'd expected, Tempe was a rather nondescript, neither particularly tall nor heavily built. He was fair-skinned, with light hair and pale grey eyes. His expression was blank as fresh paper, strangely blank, studiously blank. I knew Adem mercenaries wore blood-red clothing as a sort of badge, but Tempe's outfit was different than I'd expected. His shirt was held tight against his body, with a dozen soft leather straps. His pants, too, were belted tightly at the thigh and calf and knee. Everything was dyed the same bright and bloody red, and it fit him snugly as a gentleman's glove. As the day grew warm, I saw him begin to sweat. After living in the cool, thin air of the storm wall, he must have found the weather to be disproportionately hot. An hour before noon, he loosened the leather straps of his shirt and peeled it away, using it to wipe the sweat from his face and arms. He didn't seem even slightly self-conscious about walking the King's Highway naked to the waist. Tempe's skin was so pale it was almost the color of cream, and his body was lean and sleek, here comes the cat, as a coursing hound, his muscles shifting under his skin with an animal grace. I tried not to stare, but my eyes couldn't help but pick out the thin, pale scars that crossed his arms and chest and back. He never offered a word of complaint about the heat. Words of any sort seemed rare from him. Say hi. Why are you wet? Did you go into the sink? You know you're not supposed to do that. He likes to walk into the sink and just, like, let the water... because it's always got a slight drip. So he just sits in it until all those little drips build up and make him soaking wet. And then he jumps on me and gets me wet, and it's very uncomfortable. He's a little bastard. Anyway, words of any sort seemed rare from him, and he responded to most questions with a nod or a shake of the head. He carried a travel sack like mine, and his sword, far from being intimidating, seemed rather short and unimpressive. Dedan, oh, I like that name. Dedan was as different from Tempe. It sounds like a name from Zelda. Was as different from Tempe as one man can be from another. He was tall, wide, and thick around the chest and neck. He carried a heavy sword, a long knife. You having trouble with your balance? And wore a mismatched set of boiled leather armor, hard enough to knock on and often mended. If you have ever seen a caravan guard, then you have seen Dedan, or at least someone cut from the same bolt of cloth. He ate most, complained most, swore most, and had a stubborn streak thicker than a broad oak plank. But to be fair, he also had a friendly manner and an easy laugh. I was tempted to think of him as stupid due to his manners and his size, but Dedan had a quick wit when he bothered using it. Hespe, I'm going to say Hespe, was a female mercenary, not as rare a creature as some folk think. In appearance and equipage, she was a near mirror of Dedan. The leather, the heavy sword, the slightly weather-worn and world-wise attitude. She had broad shoulders, strong hands, and a proud face with a jaw like a cinder brick. Her hair was blonde and fine, but cut short in the fashion of a man's. But to see her as a female version of Dedan was a mistake. She was reserved where Dedan was all bravado, and while Dedan had an easy manner when his temper wasn't up, Hespe had a vague hardness about her, as if she were constantly expecting someone to give her trouble. Martin was the oldest of us, our tracker. He wore a little leather, softer and better cared for than Dedan's or Hespe's. He carried a long knife, a short knife, and a hunter's bow. Martin had worked as a huntsman before falling out of favor with the baronet whose forests he had tended. Mercenary work was a poor job by comparison, but it kept him fed. His skill with a bow made him valuable despite the fact that he wasn't nearly as physically imposing as either Dedan or Hespe. The three of them had formed a loose partnership some months ago, and had been selling their services as a group ever since. Martin told me they'd done other jobs for the mayor, the most recent of which involved scouting some of the lands around Tinu. It took me about 10 minutes to realize Martin should be the leader of this expedition. He had more woodcraft than all the rest of us put together, and had even hunted men for bounty once or twice. When I mentioned this to him, he shook his head and smiled, telling me that being able to do something and wanting to do it were two very different things indeed. Last was me, their fearless leader. The mayor's letter of introduction had described me as a discerning young man of good education and diverse, useful qualities. While this was perfectly true, it also made me sound like the most wretchedly useless court dandy in existence. Not helping matters was the fact that I was younger than any of them by years and wearing clothes more suited for a dinner party than the road. I carried my loot and the mayor's purse. I wore no sword, no armor, no knife. I dare say they didn't quite know what to make of me. No, it's actually Marten. It's Marten, and it's tempting to pronounce it Martin, but I really don't like the way that sounds, so I'm trying to say Marten. But then that also kind of sounds like I'm pretentiously saying the word Martin, so I don't really know how to win there. I'm just gonna roll with Martin. Just gonna lean into it. The sun was about an hour from setting when we passed a tinker on the road. He wore the traditional brown robe, belted with a length of rope. He didn't have a cart, but led a single donkey so loaded with bundles of oddments that it looked like a mushroom. He made his slow way toward us, singing, "If you need no mending, and nothing needs tending, a wise man will still see the right time for spending. Enjoy the sunshine, but though you might feel fine, if you don't stop now, you'll be filled with regret. It's better to simply pay, and prepare for a rainy day, than think of the tinker when you're dripping wet." I laughed and applauded. Proper traveling tinkers are a rare breed of people, and I am always glad to see one. My mother told me that they were lucky, and my father had valued them for their news. The fact that I was in desperate need of a few items made this meeting 3 times welcome. "Ho, tinker," Dedan said, smiling. "I need fire and a pint. How long before we hit an inn?" The tinker pointed back the way he had come. "Not 20 minutes' walk." He eyed Dedan. "But you can't tell me there's nothing you need," he admonished. "Everyone needs something." Dedan shook his head politely. "I beg your pardon, tinker. My purse is too thin." "How about you?" The tinker eyed me up and down. "You've the look of a lad who's wanting something." "I do need a few things," I admitted. Seeing the others look longingly down the road, I motioned them on. "Go ahead," I told them. "I'll be a few minutes." As they headed off, the tinker rubbed his hands together, grinning. "Well now, what is it you're looking for?" "Some salt, to begin with." "And a box to put it in," he said as he began to rummage around his donkey's packs. "I could use a knife, too, if you have one that's not too hard to come by." "Especially if you're heading north," he said, without missing a beat. "Dangerous road that way." Not gonna do it. Not gonna do the South Park voice. Wouldn't do to be without a knife." "Do you have any trouble?" Did you have any trouble?" I asked, hoping he might know something that could help us fight the bandits. "Oh, no," he said as he dug through his packs. "Things aren't so bad that anyone would dream of laying hands on a tinker. Still, it's a bad stretch of road." He produced a long, narrow knife in a leather sheath and handed it to me. "Ramston steel." I drew it out of its sheath and gave the blade a close look. It was Ramston steel. "I don't need anything that fine," I said, handing it back. I'll be putting it to everyday use, eating mostly." "Ramston's fine for everyday use," the tinker said, pushing it back into my hands. "You can use it to trim kindling, then shave with it if you like. Keeps an edge forever." "I might have to put it to hard use," I clarified. "And Ramston's brittle." "There is that," the tinker admitted easily. "As my father always used to say, the best knife you'll ever have until it breaks." Okay, sorry, I thought that was not a complete sentence. Well, Kvothe is definitely very bard-like. I mean, he plays the lute. I don't know. Okay. Okay, yeah. As my father used to say, the best knife you'll ever have until it breaks, but the same could be said of any knife, and truth be told, that's the only knife I have. I sighed. I know when I'm being skinned. And a tinder box. He held one out almost before I finished saying it. I couldn't help but notice you've got a little ink about the fingers. He gestured at my hands. I've got some paper here, good quality. Pen and ink, too. Nothing worse than having an idea for a song and not being able to write it down. He held out a leather parcel of paper, pens, and ink. I shook my head, knowing that the mayor's purse would only stretch so far. I think I'm done with songwriting for a while, Tinker. He shrugged, still holding it out. Letter writing, then. I know a fellow who had to open a vein once to write a note to his lady-love. Dramatic, true. Symbolic, certainly. But also painful, unsanitary, and more than slightly macabre. Now he carries pen and ink with him wherever he goes. I felt the color drain from my face as the Tinker's words reminded me of something else I'd forgotten in my rush to leave Severin. Denna. All thought of her had been forced out of my mind by... Someone cutting themselves made him think of Denna? Okay. All thought of her had been forced out of my mind by a night with no sleep, 2 bottles of strong wine, and the mayor's talk of bandits. I had left without a word after our terrible fight. What would she... No, bandits, not assassins. What would she think if I spoke so cruelly to her, then simply disappeared? I was already a full day's journey from Severin. I couldn't go back just to tell her I was leaving, could I? I considered it for a moment. No. Besides, Denna herself had disappeared for days without a word of warning. Surely she would understand if I did the same. Stupid, stupid, stupid. My thoughts spun in circles as I tried to decide among my several unpleasant options. The harsh hee-haw of the Tinker's donkey startled a thought into me. Are you headed to Severin, Tinker? More through than to, he said, but yes. I just remembered a letter I need to send. If I gave it to you, could you deliver it to a certain inn? He nodded slowly. I could, he said, given that you'll be needing paper and ink. He smiled, waving the package again. Oh, okay, good to know. Okay. I don't know these things. I grimaced. I will, Tinker, but how much will the lot of this cost me? He looked at the accumulated items. Salt and box, 4 bits, knife, 15 bits, paper, pens, and ink, 18 bits, tinder box, 3 bits. And the delivery? I said. An urgent delivery, the Tinker said with a bit of a smile. To a lady, unless I mistake the look on your face. I nodded. Right. He rubbed his chin. Ordinarily I'd push for about 35, then have a nice leisurely dicker where you bargain me down to 30. The price was reasonable, especially considering how hard it was to find good paper. Still, it was a full third of the money the mayor had given me. We would need that money for food, lodging, and other supplies. But before I could say anything, the Tinker continued. Now I can tell that's too much for your comfort, he said. And I hope you don't think me too forward in saying this, but that is a rather fine cloak you're wearing. I'm always willing to make a fellow a trade. I pulled my lovely burgundy cloak around me self-consciously. I suppose I'd be willing to give it up, I said, not having to fake the regret in my voice. But that will leave me with no cloak at all. What will I do when it rains? No trouble there, the Tinker said. He pulled a bundle of cloth out of a pack and held it up for me to see. It had been black once upon a time, but long use and many washings had faded it to a dark greenish color. It's a little tatty, I said, reaching out to finger a fraying seam. Yeah, owls would be helpful in this book for sure. It's just broken in, that's all, he said easily, spreading it across my shoulders. Good fit. Good color for you. Brings out your eyes. Besides, you don't want to be looking too well off, what with those bandits on the road. I sighed. What will you give me in trade? I asked, handing my beautiful cloak over to him. That cloak's not a month old, mind you, and it's never even seen a drop of rain. The Tinker ran his hands over my beautiful cloak. It's got all sorts of little pockets, he said admiringly. That's just lovely. I fingered the thinning cloth of the Tinker's cloak. Yeah, that would be a good plan. If you'll throw in needle and thread, I'll trade you my cloak for the lot of it. There's an H near it, I guess that's why I did that. I said with sudden inspiration. Plus, I'll give you an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. I grinned. It was a pittance. But that's what tinkers in stories ask for when they trade some fabulous piece of magic to an unsuspecting widow's son when he's off to make his fortune in the world. The tinker threw his head back and laughed. "I was about to suggest that very thing," he said. Then he tossed my cloak over his arm and shook my hand firmly. I fished around in my purse and handed over an iron drab, 2 vintage halfpennies, and, much to my pleasant surprise, an Auturan hardpenny. The last was lucky for me, as it was only worth a fraction of a vintage silver round. I emptied the dozen pockets of my burgundy cloak into my travel sack and collected my new possessions from the tinker. My upstairs neighbor is, I don't know, jumping rope? I don't know what she's doing up there, but I feel like the roof is going to cave in. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's very loud. It's pure chaos in this apartment. If it's not music from there or up there, it's pounding or crashing or doors slamming. There's just always noise. I hate it. I hate it. Anyway. And dogs barking, too. Where was I? I emptied the dozen pockets of my burgundy cloak into my travel sack and collected my new possessions from the tinker. Then I wrote a quick letter to Denna, explaining that my patron had sent me away unexpectedly. I apologized for the rash things I'd said, and told her I would meet with her as soon as I was back in Severn. I would have liked more time to compose it. I would have liked to give it a more subtle apology, a more detailed explanation, but the tinker had finished packing away my beautiful cloak and was obviously eager to be on his way again. Not having any sealing wax to secure the letter, I used a trick I had invented while writing notes on the mayor's behalf. I folded the piece of paper against itself, then tucked it together in such a way that it would be necessary to tear the paper in order to unfold it again. I handed it to the tinker. "It goes to a pretty, dark-haired woman by the name of Denna. She's staying at the Four Tapers in Severn Low." Must have been a cool time where you could just describe someone and where they are, like the name of the place, and not have to give an address or anything. It's pretty cool. "That reminds me," he exclaimed as he tucked my letter into a pocket. "Candles." He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a handful of fat tallow tapers. "Everyone needs candles." Funny thing was, I could use some, though not for the reasons he thought. "I've also got some rubbing wax for your boots," he continued, rooting through his bundles. "We get fierce rain this time of year." I held up my hands, laughing. I'll give you a bit for 4 candles, but I can't afford any more. If this keeps up, I'll have to buy your donkey just to carry the lot with me." "Suit yourself," he said with an easy shrug. "Pleasure doing business with you, young sir." Alright, I am. Below me is just the ground, I think. Oh, the other cat's here. You're both here. But you're not going to come on camera, are you? You don't look like it. Hi. What do you want? Louie's staring at him like, "Excuse me, this is my turf? I'm on her lap? I don't know what you think you're doing." You can both be here. If there are noise complaints, I don't know about it. But I think I'm a pretty quiet person, so I would be surprised still. Alright, chapter 76. Tinder. The sun was starting to set by the time we found a good place to camp on the second night. Dedan went foraging for firewood. Martin began cutting up carrots and potatoes and sent Hespe to fill the cookpot with water. I used Martin's small spade to dig a pit for our fire. Without being asked, Tempe picked up a branch and used his sword to shave thin strips of dry wood to use for tinder. Unsheathed, his sword still didn't seem terribly impressive, but given how easily it was peeling away paper-thin strips of wood, it must have been sharp as a shaving razor. I finished lining the pit with stones. Wordlessly, Tempe handed me a handful of tinder. I nodded. "Would you like to use my knife?" I asked, hoping to draw him into a bit of conversation. I'd barely shared a dozen words with him in the last 2 days. Tempe's pale gray eyes looked at the knife on my belt, then back at his sword. He shook his head, fidgeting nervously. "Isn't it bad for the edge?" I asked. The mercenary shrugged, avoiding my eye. I began to lay the fire, and that is when I made my first mistake. There was a chill in the air, and we were all of us tired, so rather than spend half an hour... There we go. This is Bagheera. He's never on camera. Rare Bagheera sighting. And Louie's like right underneath him on my lap. You can't, just out of frame. He looks annoyed. Okay. I'm covered in cats. Come here. You gonna nudge my book out of my hand? Is that what you're trying to do? Okay, let's see. So rather than spend half an hour slowly nursing a spark into a decent campfire, I arranged twigs around Tempe's tinder, then stacked progressively bigger sticks around it, making a tightly packed cluster of wood. Dedan returned with another armload of firewood just as I was finishing. Bagheera, wow, that was rude. He just sat on Louis's face, and Louis, like squirmed out from underneath him and then, walked away. You are such a dick. He's like, she's mine now. This is my lap. Okay. I've never seen him do that before. That was really funny. Oh my god. Anyway. Dedan returned with another armload of firewood just as I was finishing. Lovely, he groused, quiet enough he could pretend he was just talking to himself, but loud enough so everyone could hear. And you're in charge. Wonderful. What's stuck in your teeth now? Martin asked tiredly. I guess that's an expression that means what's bothering you. What's stuck in your teeth now? Boy's making a little wooden fort, not a fire, Dedan sighed dramatically, then assumed a tone he probably thought was fatherly, but came across as profoundly condescending. Here, I'll help you out. A spark will never catch on that. Do you have flint and steel? I'll show you how to use them. No one enjoys being talked down to, but I have a particular aversion to it. Dedan had been making it clear for 2 days that he thought I was an idiot. I gave a tired sigh. My oldest, most world-weary sigh. That was how I needed to play it. He thought of me as young and useless. I needed to drive home the point that I was nothing of the sort. Dedan, I asked, what do you know about me? He gave me a blank look. You know one thing about me, I said calmly. You know the mayor put me in charge. I looked him in the eye. Is the mayor an idiot? Dedan made a dismissive gesture. Of course not. I was just saying. I stood up and regretted it, as it just brought into sharp contrast how much taller he was. Would the mayor have put me in charge if I were an idiot? He gave an insincere smile, trying to pass off 2 days' worth of derogatory muttering as some sort of misunderstanding. Now, don't get all twisted up over. I held up my hand. This isn't your fault. You just don't know anything about me. But let's not waste time on it tonight. We're all tired. For now, rest assured that I'm not some rich tit's son, out for a lark. I pinched a thin piece of Tempe's tinder between my fingers and concentrated. I pulled more heat than I needed and felt my arm go chilly all the way to the shoulder. And rest assured I know how to start a fire. The shaved pieces of wood caught fire, flaring up hot and sudden, catching the rest of the tinder and making flames leap up almost immediately. I'd meant it to be a dramatic gesture so Dedan would stop thinking of me as some useless boy, but the time I spent at the university had made me jaded. Starting a fire like this... Nice tinder joke. I was waiting for that. Starting a fire like this was as simple as putting on your boots for a member of the Arcanum. I read that wrong. I'm going to reread that. Starting a fire like this was as simple as putting on your boots for a member of the Arcanum. Dedan, on the other hand, had never met an Arcanist, and probably had never been within 500 miles of the university. Everything he knew about magic was from campfire stories. Yes, okay. So when the I don't know, I'm having trouble today. I'm very tired. So when the fire flared up, he went pale as a sheet and took several sudden steps back. He looked for all the words as if I'd suddenly called up a roaring... Oh, he looked for all the world as if I had suddenly called up a roaring sheet of fire like Timorlin the Great. Then I saw Martin and Hespe wearing the same expression, native vintage superstition written clearly on their faces. Their eyes went to the flickering fire, then back to me. I was one of those. I meddled with dark powers. I summoned demons. I ate the entire little cheese, including the rind. Looking at their stunned faces, I realized nothing I said would set them at ease. Not right now. So instead, I sighed and began to set up my sleeping roll for the night. While there wasn't much cheerful conversation around the fire that night, there wasn't any muttering from Dedan either. I'd like respect, but failing that, a little healthy fear can go a long way to making things run smoothly. 2 days with no further dramatics on my part helped everyone relax. Dedan was still all bluff and bravado, but he had quit calling me boy and was only complaining about half as much, so I considered it a victory. Yeah, the cheese threw me off too. I'm like, So, evil demons eat the rind of the cheese? Okay. Flushed with this lukewarm success, I decided to make an active attempt to draw Tempe into a conversation. If I was going to be in charge of this little group, I needed to know more about him. Most importantly, I needed to know if he could speak more than 5 words in a row. So I approached the Adem mercenary when we stopped for our midday meal. He was sitting slightly apart from the rest of us. He wasn't standoffish. It's just that the rest of us would sit and talk while we ate. Sorry, I'm laughing at the cat again because he's being so sweet and affectionate and like peaceful right now, and I just keep thinking about the fact that he sat on Louis. And like Louis over there by himself now. You're so terrible. Look at this face. Okay. So I approached the Adem mercenary when we stopped for our midday meal. He was sitting slightly apart from the rest of us. He wasn't standoffish, it's just that the rest of us would sit and talk while we ate. Tempe, on the other hand, simply ate. But today I made a point of sitting down next to him with my lunch, a chunk of hard sausage and some cold potatoes. "Hello, Tempe." He looked up and nodded. "Hello." For a second I caught a glimpse of his pale gray eyes. Then he looked away, shifting restlessly. He ran his hand through his hair. And for a second he reminded me of Simon. They both had the same slender build and sandy hair. "And now you're done?" That was all I got? You sat on Louis for that? Okay. They both had the same slender build and sandy hair. Simon wasn't this quiet, though. Sometimes I could barely get a word in edgewise with Sim. I'd tried to talk to Tempe before, of course. Ordinary small talk. The weather, sore feet after a long day's walk, the food. These had all come to nothing. At best a word or two. More often a nod or a shrug. But most common was a blank look followed by fidgeting and a stubborn refusal to do so much as look me in the eye. So today I had a conversational gambit. "I have heard stories about the Lethani," I said. "I would like to know more. Would you tell me about it?" Tempe's pale eyes touched mine briefly, his expression still blank. Then he looked away again. He tugged one of the red leather straps that held his shirt close to his body and fidgeted with his sleeve. "No, I will not speak on Lethani. It is not for you. Do not ask." He looked away from me again, down at the ground. I counted in my head. 16 words. That answered one of my questions, at least. I'm trying to figure out why my mouth feels like drier than usual. I feel like thirstier than usual, like I ate a bunch of salt, but I didn't. I guess I'm just very dehydrated. Chapter 77. Pennyworth. Twilight was settling in as we rounded a curve in the road. I heard clapping and stomping mingled with music, shouting, and roars of laughter. After 10 hours of walking, the sound lifted my spirits to an almost cheerful level. Located at the last major crossroad south of the Eld, the Pennyworth Inn was enormous. Built of rough-hewn timber, it had 2 full stories and a scattering of gables that hinted at a smaller 3rd floor above that. Wasn't that 15 words? I'm gonna look. Because I'm curious now. Did he count wrong? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That was 15. "No, I will not speak on Lethani. It is not for you. Do not ask." Yeah. Huh. Maybe he's counting... Nope. There are no contractions in there. That's weird. Yeah, okay. I wonder why that happened. He did count wrong. Were you counting in your head as I read it? Or did you just, like, remember what I read and count it in your head? Anyway. Where was I? You should contact the author and tell him, like, hey, you gotta reprint your book because you made a mistake. Okay. Through the windows I caught glimpses of... Wait, let me see. Built of rough-hewn timber, it had 2 full stories and a scattering of gables that hinted at a smaller third floor above that. Through the windows I caught glimpses of men and women dancing while an unseen fiddler sawed out a mad and breathless tune. Okay. I mean, it is funny. Dedan took a deep breath. Can you smell that? I tell you, there's a woman in this place could cook a stone and make me beg for more. Sweet Peg. By these hands, I hope she's still around. He made a curving gesture, showing the double meaning of his words as he nudged Martin with an elbow. Hespe's eyes narrowed as she stared at the back of Dedan's head. Oblivious, Dedan continued. Tonight I'll sleep with a bellyful of lamb and brandy, although a little less sleeping might prove a little more entertaining if my last trip here was any indication. I saw the storm brewing on Hespe's face, and spoke up quickly. Whatever's in the pot and a bunk for each of us, I said firmly. Anything else comes out of your own pocket. Dedan looked as if he couldn't quite believe his ears. Come off it. We've been sleeping rough for days. Besides, 'tain't your money. Don't be a stingy shim with it. We haven't done our job yet, I said calmly. Not even a piece of it. I don't know how long we may be out here, but I know I'm not rich. If we run through the mayor's purse too quickly, we're going to have to hunt for what we eat. I looked around at everyone. Unless someone else has enough coin to keep us fed and cares to share. Martin smiled ruefully at the suggestion. Hespe's eyes were for Dedan, who continued glowering in my direction. Tempe fidgeted, his expression unreadable as ever. Avoiding my eyes, he glanced at everyone in turn, his expression blank. His eyes moved, not from face to face, but at Dedan's hands, then Dedan's feet, then Martin's feet, then Hespe's, then mine. He shifted his weight and moved a half-step closer to Dedan. Hoping to dispel the tension, I softened my tone and said, After everything is done, we'll split what's left of the purse. That way each of us will have a little extra in our pocket before we even get back to Severin. We can each spend our lots as we want to, then. I could tell Dedan wasn't pleased, and waited to see if he would press the point. Instead, it was Martin who spoke up. After a day of long walking, he said in a musing voice, as if talking to himself, a drink would go down nice. Dedan looked to his friend, then back to me expectantly. I think the purse can stand a round of drinks, I conceded with a smile. I don't think the mayor is trying to make priests out of us, do you? This got a throaty laugh from Hespe, while Martin and Dedan cracked smiles. Tempe glanced at me with his pale eyes, fidgeted, and looked away. A few minutes of relaxed haggling got the 5 of us common bunks, a simple supper, and a round of drinks for a single silver bit. After that was done, I found a table in a quieter corner of the room and tucked my loot out of harm's way under my bench. Then I sat down, bone-weary, and wondering what I could do to get Dedan to stop acting like such a little swaggercock. Oh, I like that word. Swaggercock. I don't think I have a first edition. I'm pretty sure the first edition was probably... I would think it would be hardcover. But this book came out so many years ago, there's like no way. But was it an error, or is it like some kind of weird thing he did on purpose for some reason? Probably an error. Anyway, where did I leave off? Swaggercock. Okay. Such was the distracted turning of my thoughts when my dinner thumped onto the table in front of me. I looked up to see a woman's face and well-advertised bosom framed by a tumble of bright red curls. Her skin was white as cream, with just the barest hint of freckle. Her lips a pale, dangerous pink. Her eyes a bright, dangerous green. Thank you, I said, somewhat belatedly. You're welcome, love. She smiled playfully with her eyes and brushed her hair back from her bare shoulder. It looked like you were almost asleepin' in your seat. I nearly was. A long day and a long road. That's a shame indeed, she said with playful regret as she rubbed the back of her neck. If I thought you'd still be on your feet in an hour, I'd take you off them. She reached out and twined her fingers lightly through the hair on the back of my head. The 2 of us would be enough to start a fire. I froze like a startled deer. I cannot say why, except perhaps that I was tired from several days on the road. Perhaps it was that I'd never been approached in such a forthright manner before. Perhaps I was young and woefully inexperienced. Let us leave it at that. I scrambled desperately for something to say, but by the time I found my tongue, she'd taken a half-step away and given me a shrewd look. I felt my face grow hot, embarrassing me further. Without thinking, I looked down at the table and the dinner she'd brought. Potato soup, I thought numbly. She gave a small, quiet laugh and touched my shoulder kindly. I'm sorry, lad. You look like you were a little more... She broke off, as if reconsidering her words, then started again. I liked the fresh look of you, but I didn't think you were that young. Though she spoke gently, I could hear the smile in her voice. It made my face burn even hotter, all the way to my ears. Finally, seeming to realize that anything she said would just embarrass me further, she took her hand off my shoulder. "I'll be back to see if you need anything later." I nodded dumbly and watched her go. Her retreat was pleasing, but I was distracted by the sounds of scattered laughter. I looked around to see amusement on the faces of the men sitting at the long tables around me. One group raised their mugs in a silent, mocking salute. Another fellow leaned over to pat my back consolingly, saying, "Don't take it personal, boy. She's turned all of us away." Feeling as if everyone in the room was watching me, I kept my eyes low and began to eat my dinner. As I tore off pieces of bread and dipped them in my soup, I composed a mental catalogue of the extent of my idiocy. I almost said idiocracy. Fantasy version of Hooters. That's exactly what that is. That's exactly what that is. For a second I was like, they're not in a brothel, are they? But no. As I tore off pieces of bread and dipped them in my soup, I composed a mental catalogue of the extent of my idiocy. Surreptitiously, I watched the red-haired serving girl entertain and rebuff the ploys of a dozen men as she carried drinks from table to table. I had regained a bit of my composure by the time Martin slid into a chair next to me. "You did a good job with Dedan out there," he said without preamble. My spirits lifted a bit. "Did I?" Martin nodded slightly as his sharp eyes wandered over the crowd that filled the room. "Most folk try to bully him, make him feel stupid. He'd have paid you back 10 times the trouble if you'd done it that way." "He was being stupid," I pointed out, "and when you come right down to it, I did bully him." It was his turn to shrug. "But you did it smart, so he'll listen to you. He'll still listen to you." He took a drink and paused, changing the subject. "Hespe offered to share a room with him tonight," he said casually. "Really?" I said, more than slightly surprised. "She's getting bolder." He gave a slow nod. "And?" I prompted. "And nothing. Dedan said he'd be damned before he spent money on a room he should have for free." He slid his eyes to me and raised an eyebrow. "You're not serious," I said flatly. "He has to know. He's just playing the simpleton because he doesn't like her." "I don't think so," Martin said, turning toward me and lowering his voice a bit. 3 span ago we finished a caravan job from Raelian. It was a long haul, and Dedan and me had a pocketful of coin and nothing in particular to do with it, so by the end of the night we were sitting in this grubby little dockside tavern, too drunk to stand up and leave, and he starts talking about her. Martin shook his head slowly. "He went on for an hour, and you wouldn't have recognized the woman he was describing as our hard-eyed Hespe. He practically sang about her." He sighed. "He thinks she's too good for him. And he's convinced if he so much as looked at her sideways he'd end up with his arm broken in 3 places. "Why didn't you tell him?" "Tell him what?" "That was before she started going all cow-eyed over him. I thought his worries were fairly sensible at the time. What do you think Hespe would do to you if you were to give her a friendly pat on any of her friendlier parts?" I looked over to where Hespe stood at the bar. One foot tapped roughly in time to the rhythm of the fiddle. Other than that, the set of her shoulders, her eyes, the line of her jaw were all hard, almost belligerent. There was a small but noticeable gap between her and the men standing on either side of her at the bar. "I probably wouldn't risk my arm either," I admitted. "But he has to know by now. He isn't blind. He's no worse off than the rest of us." I started to protest, then I glanced at the red-haired serving girl. "We could tell him," I said. "You could. He trusts you." Martin sucked at his teeth with his tongue. "Nah," he said, setting his drink down firmly. "It would just make things muddier. Either he'll see it or he won't. In his own time, in his own way." He shrugged. "Or not, and the sun will rise in the morning." Will still rise in the morning. I'd like to skip the word still for some reason. Neither of us spoke for a long while. Martin watched the buzzing room over the top of his mug, his eyes growing distant. I let the noise of the place fade to a low, comforting purr as I leaned against the wall, drowsing. As my thoughts tend to do, they wandered to Denna. I thought about the smell of her, the arch of her neck near her hair, the way her hands moved when she talked. I wondered where she was tonight, if she was well. I wondered just a bit if her thoughts ever wandered into warm musings of me. Hunting bandits shouldn't be hard. Besides, it'll be nice to get the jump on them for a change. Lawless, damn Ravel bastards. The words drew me out of my warm drowse like a fish yanked from a pool. The fiddler had stopped playing to have a drink, and in the relative quiet of the room, Dedan's voice was loud as a donkey's bray. I opened my eyes and saw Martin was looking around in mild alarm, too, no doubt roused by the same words that caught my ear. It only took me a second to spot Dedan. He was sitting 2 tables away, having a drunken conversation with a gray-haired farmer. Martin was already getting to his feet. Not wanting to draw attention to the situation, I hissed, "Get him!" and forced myself back into my seat. Yeah, I know. I was thinking that earlier, too. Pretty much my exact thought. Just new characters, all of a sudden. I gritted my teeth as Martin threaded quickly through the tables, tapped Dedan on the shoulder, and jerked a thumb toward the table where I sat. Dedan grumbled something I'm glad I didn't hear, and grudgingly pushed himself to his feet. I forced my eyes to wander around the room rather than follow Dedan. Tempe was easy to spot in his mercenary reds. He was facing the hearth, watching the fiddler tune his instrument. There were several empty glasses on the table in front of him, and he had loosened the leather straps of his shirt. He eyed the fiddler with a strange intensity. As I watched, a serving girl brought him another drink. He looked her over, his pale eyes moving pointedly up and down her body. She said something, and he kissed the back of her hand as smoothly as a courtier. She blushed and pushed at his shoulder playfully. One of his hands moved smoothly to the curve of her waist and rested there. She didn't seem to mind. Dedan stepped close to my table, eclipsing my view of Tempe, just as the fiddler lifted his bow and began to saw out a jig. A dozen people came to their feet, eager to dance. "What?" Dedan demanded as he came to stand in front of my table. "Have you called me over here to tell me it's getting late? That I've got a busy day tomorrow and I should tuck my little self into bed?" He leaned forward onto the table, putting his eyes more on level with mine. I caught a sour smell on his breath. A dreg. A cheap, repulsive liquor you can start fires with. I laughed dismissively. "Hell, I'm not your mum." Actually, I had been about to say that very thing and scrambled mentally for something else to distract him with. My eye lighted on the redhead who had served me my dinner earlier that evening, and I leaned forward in my seat. "I was wondering if you could tell me something," I said in my best conspiratorial tone. His scowl gave way to curiosity, and I lowered my voice a little more. "You've been here before, right?" He nodded, leaning a little closer. "You know what that girl's name is?" I nodded my head in the redhead's direction. Dedan took an over-careful look over his shoulder that surely would have drawn her attention if she hadn't been facing away from us. The blonde one the Adem's pawing at?" Dedan asked. "Redhead." Dedan's broad forehead wrinkled as he squinted the far side of the room into focus. "Losine?" he asked softly. He turned to me, still squinting. "Little Losi?" I shrugged and began to regret my choice of diversionary tactic. An explosive laugh burst out of the big man, and he half fell, half slid onto the bench across from me. "Losey!" He chuckled a little more loudly than I liked. "Kvoth, I had you all wrong." He slapped the table with the flat of his hand and laughed again, nearly tipping himself over backward on the bench. "Ah, you've got a good eye, boy, but you haven't got a damn chance." My battered pride pricked up at this. "Why not? Isn't she, well—" I trailed off, making an inarticulate gesture. He somehow managed to gather my meaning. "A whore?" he asked incredulously. "God, boy, no! There's a couple around." He made a sweeping gesture over his head, then lowered his voice to a more private level. "Not really whores, mind you. Just girls who don't mind a little extra at night." He paused, blinked. "Money. Extra money. And extra other things," he chortled. "I just thought—" I began weakly. "Aye, any man who ever had eyes and balls thought that." He leaned a little closer. "She's a lusty little one. She'll trip a man who catches her eye, but she can't be talked or bought into bed. If she could, she'd be rich as the king of Vint." He looked in her direction. "How much is a roll with that worth?" "I'd give—" He squinted in her direction, his lips moving as if going through some silent, complex arithmetic. After a moment he shrugged. "More than I've got." He looked back to me, shrugged again. "Still, it's no good wishing. Save yourself the trouble. If you want, I know a lady here who's no shame to look at. Might be willing to brighten up your evening." He started to look around the room. "No!" I put my hand on his arm to stop him. "I was just curious, that's all." I sounded insincere, and I knew it. "Thanks for filling me in." "Nothing to it." He carefully got to his feet. "Oh," I said, as if a thought had just occurred to me. "Could you do me a favor?" He nodded, and I gestured him closer. "I'm worried Hespe might end up talking about our job for the mayor. If the bandits here were hunting them, things will get 10 times harder." A guilty look flashed across his face. "I'm pretty sure she wouldn't mention it, but you know how women like to talk." "I understand," he said quickly as he stood up. "I'll talk to her. Better to be careful." The hawk-faced fiddler finished his jig, and everyone clapped and stomped and pounded empty mugs on their tables. I sighed and rubbed my face into my hands. When I looked up, I saw Martin at the table next to mine. He touched his fingers to his forehead and nodded a small salute. I gave a slight seated bow. It's always nice to have an appreciative audience. Alright. Yeah, the next chapter's a little long. I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. And I'll open up my island for you, Eric. And just decompress for a little while before I go back to working on the thing that I was working on. So, thanks for watching. I will figure out, I'll figure out which day I'm doing next later. Well, you guys have a good night.